Welcome to The Plain Truth, the show where we go into some of the mysteries, anomalies, and the dirty underbelly of the world around us. I'm your host, Paul, and joining us this week we have Lada Ray, who writes about geopolitical matters and things having to do with Russia, as well as very interesting metaphysical topics. But the focus of today's show is going to be on some geopolitics. Lada, are you there?
Hello, Paul. Hello, everyone.
Well, thanks for joining us. We appreciate it. I guess I should say that today we were hoping to cover something that I feel has been a bit undercovered in the alternative media world, which is the very dramatic changes going on in the Middle East. So I was wondering if you could give us some thoughts on that. But I'll tell you what, before we start, why don't you let everyone know your website, just in case they're not familiar with your work.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yes, thank you. So the main blog is Futurist Trendcast, which you should go to a search engine and just it will come up. But the full address is Futurist Trendcast, one T in the middle, .wordpress.com. And my personal official website, where everything that I do is posted, all the links, my webinars, my archived reports, consultations, some free theories, free materials, resources, and such. It's ladaray.com. Very simple. Of course, I have a YouTube channel. Just punch in Lada Ray and it will come up. It's just simply Lada Ray on YouTube and Twitter. On Twitter, it's at Lada Tweets.
Okay. Well, now, the heart of today's show is going to be about the big changes going on in the Middle East and how you see them. First of all, what do you think is actually going on? I mean, all this talk about the Kurds or Turkey and Iran, the Saudi situation. I mean, there's so much going on, but how do you read it?
Okay, well, it's not just how I read it. The reason we really needed to talk today, Paul, is because there is a major shift happening in the Middle East as we speak. It began, let's just say it manifested on November 20th, which was last Monday. So it's less than a week that the shift became manifest and everybody just saw it. But of course, it's been going on ever since Russia went into Syria. So this is really the key to understanding everything that is happening in the Middle East right now. I know we agreed that this is going to be a geopolitical focus show this time, and that I will not really talk about my theories and metaphysical matters, but I just need to emphasize one more time, forgive me for bringing it up, because this is key to understanding everything, that my Earth shift theory, the Great Earth shift theory, and Russia, the Great Balancer theory are keys to understanding what is happening in the Middle East. And in the Middle East, we're experiencing a major Earth shift. This is the shift of everything we knew about the Middle East, how things were done there, who was friends and who was foes, how the West interfered and basically owned the Middle East and could dictate whatever they wanted to dictate. So all this is changing. The consciousness of people is changing. Hence the Earth shift, which is a multidimensional thing, not just physically on 3D, but beyond that. Okay, that's all I'm going to say about this. For my theories, go to ladaray.com and to Futurist Trendcast to understand a lot more about that. There's tons of free information there. So, what is really happening in the Middle East? First of all, major breaking news. Last Monday, that was November 20th, there was a secret meeting when Assad, the president of Syria, flew into Sochi to meet Putin. We found out about the meeting, all of us, the press, and all of us, whoever are the watchers of Syria, of the Middle East, and of Russia. We found out the fact. I contacted you as soon as I could to tell you that this is very important to follow through on this. So what that meeting basically established, and note that Assad traveled outside the country ever since the beginning of the Syrian conflict twice. in 2015, when Russia just first went into Syria, he went to Moscow to meet Putin. And this is his only second trip outside the country, now to meet Putin in Sochi, both meetings in Russia with Putin. I'm emphasizing that to actually help people understand the importance of Russia in this whole scenario. Now, another thing I wrote multiple times about on my blog throughout, ever since 2014, but especially in 2015, 16, and in this year, is that there is a veritable pilgrimage of Middle Eastern leaders and various officials and important figures from the Middle East to Russia and to Moscow or to Sochi, wherever Putin and Lavrov might be at the moment, from all walks of life, all countries, big and small, important and not so important, including Saudi Arabia, including Qatar, including Egypt, Turkey, Iran, Israel, amongst many others. And we will talk some more about it later. So veritable pilgrimage. You couldn't believe it if you tried. People who've never visited Russia, including the Saudi king, was recently in Russia talking to Putin with huge, big delegation, promising that they are, notice that they're shifting trade and promising big contracts to Russians. You know, I just want to remind everybody who watches these things that Trump visited Saudi Arabia about a month ago, I would say, maybe 2 months ago, in that time frame. And he supposedly signed, but that was just a bare promise, a big contract, anywhere between 12 billion, the range was between 12 billion and up to 400 billion or something, some crazy amount, or at least 100 billion in arms contracts with Saudis, as if Saudis would buy all this from the US. So the Saudi king comes following that Trump's trip to Saudi Arabia, comes to Moscow and promises contracts to Moscow, and not just military contracts, all kinds of construction, joint construction projects, both in Saudi Arabia and in Russia, oil and gas projects, things that are unheard of. You know, you literally see in front of our very eyes what I predict since early 2010s, the earth shift is happening. The major shift when Russia, the great balancer, is rebalancing the world. And why is Middle East so important in this? The Middle East is literally, when you just look at the map of the world, as if you just like take the globe and make it into the map, you will see that the Middle East is literally the center. It's the middle of that earthly globe, human globe that we are used to, with all the continents around it. The Middle East is straight in the center. It actually is the center of our world, if you think about it that way, okay? The way we're used to thinking about the maps. And so the center, very important what's happening in the center. And this whole skirmish and these incongruences, these wars and conflicts and brother killing brother, civil wars, color revolutions, Sunnis versus Shia, the parts of the same country against another, ISIL and Jabhat al-Nusra and all these brotherhoods, Muslim brotherhood, whatnot. All this is part of the earth shift. You know, they have to decide which way they're going. Everybody's pulling in their own direction. So what we are seeing right now is that there is a new Tsar of the Middle East. It has already been announced by so many sources, including in the West and in the Middle East. It is considered there is the same way. New Tsar arrived. It is Putin the peacemaker. Everybody wants to talk to Putin. Everybody wants to go to Russia. It doesn't matter what side of the political, religious, etc. spectrum they are. As long as they're not terrorists, Russians will make an effort to form some kind of alliance and bring together sides that were unbringable together, such as Turkey and Iran. And so following Assad arriving to Russia, and that was to check the notes and to agree on the roadmap for political reconciliation. So Putin convinced Assad, finally, I predicted that in 2015 and said that's what Assad and Russia need to do. In Earthshift Report 5, those who follow my Earthshift Report 5, the Syria Game Changer, it was called. And you can still read it on ladaray.com. So in that report, I said that literally Assad has to abandon all these old, outdated ideas of how the country is run. Of course, constitution is necessary. And of course, he has to allow Kurds in the process, which were not allowed previously, and other factions as well. And this is what's happening. So now Assad will have to give up some of his power and run for re-election. If he's re-elected, and it's hard to imagine he will not be re-elected, because he actually won this war with Russia's big help. And so Russia, in addition, and Assad jointly announced that the war against ISIL is not really over, but nearing its last leg. And terrorists will soon be out of Syria. And then the most important thing is to start the political process. So this meeting ended, Assad flew back, or maybe he's still in Sochi. Nobody actually knows this. And here's why. I will tell you why this actually is not entirely known. Because right after Assad left, two other big players, major players in the Middle East arrived to meet Putin. And these are Iran and Turkey, Iranian president and Turkish President Erdogan. And these never sat at the same table before. They are geopolitical rivals. They've been rivals for centuries. And it was inconceivable even just a few months ago, I would say, probably, and definitely a year ago, that these two would be at the same table. And now they're talking like these major allies. Putin also had conversations with other powers that play in the Middle East. He had an hour conversation with Trump. He had a conversation with Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu, then Egyptian president, and Saudi king, as well as, or Saudi, whoever they have as who talks for the king at any given moment, and Qatarians also. There was a conversation with Qatar. So basically what those conversations amounted to when Turkish and Iranian presidents were on their way to Sochi, what those conversations actually amounted to was that, hello, say Benjamin, that's Netanyahu, or hello, Donald, I am here informing you that the three of us, which is Russia, Turkey, and Iran, are reformatting the Middle East. No more any sort of negotiations or any sort of conditions from this side or that side. We, the three, are reformatting the Middle East as we speak. And I'm here to inform you of this fact. And so the meeting is in Sochi, right? And just remember history, 1945, February, three great powers, they're called the Big Three, gather in where? In Yalta, not too far from Sochi, also on the Black Sea. And those were, of course, Stalin, Roosevelt, and Churchill. The war is still on, right? World War II is still on. But it is already clear that any moment now, Hitler's Germany is going to surrender. They're already closing in on Berlin. Well, a little bit later, but on Germany for sure at that moment. And they designed the new world map, basically. It was done in such a way that urban legend has it that sometimes they would actually take a napkin where they were sitting and devise the new borders on that napkin to agree on borders of the post-war Europe and post-war world. And that's what they did at the time. So this is already christened Yalta II, what just happened between the three powers in the Middle East, Russia included. And everybody wants to go to Moscow. And now let's see, Russia, the great balancer. Without Russia, none of this would have happened. So the new Tsar literally arrived. The new power that actually does things, make things happen in the Middle East is Russia. And I'm going to finish this big talk about what is happening and advising you with this news. So Assad and then Turkey and Iran, with Russians prodding, agree that in Sochi there is a meeting now. There will be a meeting, and it's already happening. It's called the Congress of the Peoples of Syria. And during this Congress, different factions, different representatives of different tribes, let's say, different religious persuasions, including the Kurds. It's not perfect, but they're already including the Kurds, and Kurds were always excluded from this. And it took a while to convince Turkey to include the Kurds, but Putin managed to convince Erdogan. So all these things are meshing together, and this Congress is supposed to continue working now down and dirty, between these little factions and big factions too, and the government. This is why Assad or his representatives are still there, because they're participating in the process. So this big Congress is what is going to decide the political future of Syria. Again, very important to understand who is conspicuously missing from this. Where is all this being agreed upon? There are no Europeans, no EU, and Putin did not call anybody in the EU. He at least called Trump to give him the courtesy of this information. No US, no EU. It's not happening in the US. It's not happening in Geneva or anything like that. It is happening in Sochi. And the symbolism here is also understandable. Remember Sochi, the 2014 Olympics, which now the West is trying to sabotage Russian athletes by taking away Russian medals and declaring that Russia did not really win Sochi Olympics and all that. And that's, of course, all to weaken Putin. And to counter all that, these Sochi meetings, they actually say, oh, in reality, this is how it works, okay? Your, feeble attempts to weaken Putin before elections by taking away Russian medals, by compromising Putin's reputation within the country, that's not really going to work, because this is what's happening in reality. This is how people in the Middle East and elsewhere, how much they trust Russia. And so this whole Sochi thing is very big. So it's Yalta 2. They're already calling it the Yalta Conference 2, and the Big Three, and the reformatting of the Middle East, and new Tsar Arrived, etc., etc. But not just Turkey and Iran were there. There are other countries, and that's also very interesting, who is present apart from the Big Three. And so one of them was Azerbaijan. That was very conspicuously visible, that next to Putin was sitting the president of Azerbaijan. And Azerbaijan is that interesting link between Turkey and Iran. They actually they have a lot of oil, and this is a former Soviet republic, and they actually have affinities with both Turkey and Iran. Therefore, they were also invited as one of those intermediary links. Also, another thing that needs to be mentioned is that a lot of peace talks actually take place between these factions in Syria. They take place in Astana. Astana is the capital of Kazakhstan. So that is another thing where Geneva talks, they tried to do Geneva talks, they fell apart every time, and they literally were abandoned. Nobody goes to those Geneva talks anymore. But in Astana, they devised this whole preliminary foundation for what is happening now in Sochi. Well, how much more effective former Soviet republics are in agreeing and bringing people together. See, this is still part of the great balancer, even if they're former republics. I also write about it in regards to the Earth-shift theory. They're still helping Russia, the great balancer, to rebalance the world, these little republics. And Putin is super effective at bringing everybody together, as we talked about in the previous interview poll that we had. Super effective. As you see, well, it's happening right in front of our very eyes, like master at work, literally. Well, that's the story in a nutshell. I have more, but I'll tell you later.
Well, that's a good start. So, okay, we can see Iran and Turkey. I mean, Erdogan and is it Rouhani with Putin? But what about the other big players? Let's say Egypt, for example. I mean, there was just this huge bombing in Egypt, I guess, right? The Sinai, I suppose, 200 and some dead. Is Egypt,
Yeah.
were they at the meeting? And I guess what I'm asking is, besides the visible three, what about the other players in the Middle East? They're coming along with this, do you think? The Saudis, the
Well,
Israelis?
I just,
Mhm.
yeah, I just, I got it. I just want to, there's a lot to say about this. I just want to emphasize one more time, this is not purely the Middle East. This is the reformatting using the normal common 3D language that is used by many and that is understood by many, reformatting of the Middle East. But also it's important in terms of the reformatting of the entire world, entire system that we live on. The old system has collapsed with the collapse of the Soviet Union. I call it, because it goes well beyond reformatting, I call it the Great Earth Shift. And Russia, the great balancer, the one that actually determines which way to balance the world, which way to, let's just say, lean the world one way or the other towards east, west, or wherever. Okay, so Russia, the great balancer, doing his job. Now, as far as Egypt, Russia has tremendous relations with president of Egypt, forget his name, sorry about that, but there are so many names to remember, and with Egypt in general. And the Egyptians are very pro-Russian at the core, and the establishment, the elites there are quite pro-Russian. Russians are trying to keep the relationship going, although this Egypt is going through very rough patches ever since that color revolution that they tried to implement. Then the military came to power and reestablished order because they understood where it was coming from, who organized that color revolution. CIA footprints were all over it. And so they really all rely, all the countries in the Middle East that have something to lose, that are not in the US pocket completely, they rely on Russia and Russian help whenever they can, even not a direct, but even indirect help, such as meeting with the leader of said country. That applies to Egypt. So Egyptian president has been in Russia and invited Putin to see him quite a few times in the past couple of years. I also wrote about that a couple of times. And it's striking how much they want to profess their trust in Russia. And why that is because Russia does not abandon their allies, that they stand by them. And they demonstrated that in Syria. And this is super respected in the Middle East. These people understand loyalty and they understand force. Okay, they understand these things very, very well. And I think Egypt was not invited. No, it was not there. As I said, Putin called them as one of the powers in the Middle East. He called the president out of courtesy and advised, just like he advised Trump or Saudi king, that this is what's happening. We are reformatting the Middle East, take it or leave it. But I think that as far as relationships go, is good as far as Egypt goes. However, Egypt is also somehow stuck between Saudis, who invest a lot in Egypt and who do influence the political process, and Russia, which is fine with Russia, because what Russia is also doing is also reformatting indirectly the attitudes in the Middle East towards US and towards itself and towards everything that goes on. So that brings us to Saudis. Saudis, you know, if somebody, I get a lot of, after we do our interviews, Paul, I get usually a bunch of various comments or emails, and people tell me, but Lada, you should consider this or you should consider that. I cannot cover everything in one interview, people, okay? I cannot cover everything. So if I did not cover Israel in our previous interview, that is because every interview has time limits. So in this case, I'm just going to mention about Saudis. People will probably write to me and say, but you cannot trust the Saudis, or you cannot trust Erdogan. Yes, that's not the point. This is called geopolitics. This is not your buddy with whom you're meeting for beer in the local pub, okay? These are people who live there. These are countries. They will not disappear. You can say goodbye to your buddy and never see him again. Or if that's a friend who betrayed you, you actually have an option not to see him again. Or you can sever all the ties. How do you sever ties with countries that will be there no matter what you do? You want to work with any countries that are your neighbors or are in your sphere of influence, regardless of how you actually feel about them. Putin is brilliant about it. He's the master. And because these countries won't, okay, what US does when they don't like some kind of leader of some kind of country is they just, they assassinate him, they execute a coup, they do all kinds of things. Russia doesn't work that way. Russia is the great balancer. Russia is trying to balance and make work any available situation. And so right now that everybody knows that the US and the EU and generally West's positions, just as I've been predicting, part of their shift, are weakening, they're going to Russia. They got it. Their noses, same goes for the Israelis. They're very good noses for where the wind blows. So what is happening with Saudis? They are what? They're changing direction. It's a big ship. It's hard to change, but they already feel that U.S. betrayed them. It's not just U.S. betrayed them or something. It's U.S. cannot do what they used to do. They are not the sole superpower. They are not even one of the two superpowers anymore. Okay, there are more than one. There's also, say, China, for example, and other powers are also vying for a place under the sun, such as Turkey and Iran, right? And Russia has to help Turkey and Iran to gain just a little bit, not too much, okay? You can't give too much power to anybody, but gain just a little bit more influence. And this is what this meeting of the big three has demonstrated. Of course, you cannot compare the power of Russia with the power of Iran or Turkey, but in the Middle East, they are powers. They are great powers in the Middle East for that specific region, okay? So that's as far as that goes. But this goes a lot further, and this is brand new breaking news. This just happened today or possibly yesterday. I just got this intel in today, and this is really interesting. You mentioned Saudi Arabia, and watch this. So Sudan president, the president of Sudan, also visited Putin and talked to him, and he offered Russia to build a naval base in Sudan, the Red Sea, on the Red Sea shore. Okay, what does this mean? Russia never had a base in that area of the world or on the Red Sea. See, Syrian bases, what they do, they cover Eastern Mediterranean, and they actually counter US and NATO bases located all over the Mediterranean and all over Europe, etc. So they do that job. But what is the Red Sea? That's the oil hub, right? That's where Saudi Arabia is. That's Suez Canal is right there. And all that flow of oil from the Middle East goes through there. So if Russia has a base in Sudan, that is a completely different spread. The shift is happening so quickly and so in line with all my predictions. But what is interesting about it also is that Sudani president complains to Putin. That's what a lot of them do. They complain about the U.S. So he comes to Russia and says, I would like to offer you to build a base in my country. And that is because I want protection against the U.S. And then he says, the fact that Southern Sudan seceded from Sudan and we lost a whole chunk of territory is unrecognized, of course. And Southern Sudan, incidentally, is where the majority of the oil is concentrated that is located in Sudan. So Southern Sudan, when they knew that the government in Sudan is not pro-US, that is conducting more or less independent policies and trying to get away from the US, kind of like decouple from the US, right? When they realized that, they executed a coup, color revolution, whatever you call it, in southern Sudan. And southern Sudan is de facto a separate state, even though it's not recognized by anybody in the world. And so the main Sudan is now without the revenue from oil. So they want Russia to be there to prevent another coup or another color revolution organized by the US. And he says it point blank. This is basically, nobody is hiding this anymore. Everybody knows what's happening. And that's the new story. So Russians are considering now this new base. Of course, that's a great expense. And the problem is also with, again, wrote about it many times, the Black Sea Straits, because Russia would have to go to that base, to go from, say, Crimea, from Sevastopol, the Black Sea Fleet would have to go through the straits, and straits are in the hands of Turkey. Although Turkey is not allowed to impede traffic, but still. So you want good relations with Turkey, you want to compromise with them somehow, whether you trust Erdogan or not, you actually need to compromise. And then we have Syria. That's how Russian ships reach Syria. And then if there is also Red Sea base, Suez Canal is arguably in the hands of Egypt, another Russian friend. So that's the news spread. And so Saudis, they feel that they have to start turning. So they're trying to sit on two chairs. Qataris also were in Moscow. Russians also talk to Qatar. And Qatar is also a major pro-US and major terrorist state, if you will. They organized this horrible there was this attack on a Russian plane, and 214 people, tourists, also from Egypt, incidentally, lost their lives. Also, the attack was over Mount Sinai somewhere when the plane was taking people back home from vacation on Sinai. Not Mount Sinai, I'm sorry, I misspoke, on Sinai, Egypt. And the fingerprints of Qataris were all over it. But Russians still have to talk to them, and Qataris also are changing their tune. And when we talk about Israel, same thing there, absolutely the same thing. First, that was a couple of years ago, I heard, and I could not believe my ears actually, when I heard Netanyahu come to Moscow and tell, during the press conference, joint press conference with Putin, tell everybody that Russia can be considered Israel's friend. That's unheard of, actually. And now they're simply saying that Russia is Israel's friend. And again, we're leaving behind this discussion, outside of this discussion completely, what Israel does, how US and Israel, and who rules whom, who wags the dog, the tail, or the dog itself, who is the dog, who is the tail here. Here we're leaving all this outside this discussion. I'm just talking about the major earth shift happening in the Middle East, and how conspicuously the players that actually dictated everything in the Middle East, especially after the collapse of the USSR, they're conspicuously missing. That's EU and US. Look again at this situation and be amazed at how this situation in the Middle East changed in the past 2-3 years, ever since Russia went into Syria. Absolute, day and night.
Well, so what do you see going forward? I mean, we see all these chairs being rearranged and people sitting on 2 chairs, and maybe some people not sitting on any chairs. But a few years from now, what do you kind of envision? What do you think will change? What will it look like then? I just think the U.S. is overextended on a 3D level, to use your term, right? And basically has to withdraw. It just can't run the world anymore. But I don't know the specifics of what things might look like over there. What do you see?
If we're talking the Middle East specifically, I will tell you that. Mm-hmm. Also, I will mention about the US and its overextension and generally the world in relation with everything we talk about. So the Middle East is just, you cannot isolate the Middle East from the entire world. See, you have to take everything in this context. And this is how my mind works. My mind works globally and universally. It doesn't work, oh, let's take this specific little town or this specific little country and talk about it and talk the hell out of it, because everything is interconnected. And this is what I'm trying to impress on people and teach people how to think as a bridge, okay? How to think not just globally, but also multidimensionally, because that's where we're at. We have to think this way. If we don't, you're missing out like 90% of the information that I'm giving you or that is coming your way from elsewhere. If you're not thinking multidimensionally, okay, beyond 3D, that is. Okay, so as far as the Middle East goes, huge changes, of course, will continue. Very important. We are going back to our issue from just several days ago, Paul, when we said the Putin enigma and the upcoming Western perestroika. That was the title of the interview. For those who don't know, go and look it up on the Time on Radio channel, please. So we talked about it there, that the thing is that what is happening is Putin here to implement changes, drastic changes, which is the earth shift of everything from the West to more even distribution of power around the world, not to the East like it used to be. Oh, West, now let's shift everything to the East. But that's already giving too much power to the East. But a more even distribution of power so that nobody can usurp too much power at the same time. So that there are counterpoints around the world that could rebalance without Russia overexerting itself and therefore hurting its own people, because people have to take the brunt of this and live worse, not have a good life in Russia. So Putin is here to implement this major earth shift peacefully, without wars, without revolutions, which was the problem with Russia and other countries in the past. You try to change it, if somebody suffers. Without the suffering, just take away that excess power that does not belong from the West, but peacefully and quietly and slowly. That's how you do it without breaking all the china in the china shop, slowly, okay? Carefully, cautiously unravel these knots. And that's what he's doing. That's why the Middle East is one of the big, big priorities. Before that, the Middle East was just a crazy wild place, wild west of the Middle East, basically, where US and the EU did whatever, not EU, but Europe, UK, when it was the British Empire, did whatever they wanted, okay? And nobody could stop them or control them or even police them in any way. So now this time is gone, completely gone. And I was saying, when I wrote in 2015, I wrote 3 reports, or 2 reports, and then 2016 another, Earthshift reports on Syria, Middle East, and Turkey. And you can see them, it's like the Syria Game Changer, Erdogan's War, and there was another one about the Turkish Conundrum. And in those reports, I was saying that unfortunately, I see, at least for the next several years, these strifes and wars in the Middle East continuing, and the difficult situation continue. I actually have to say, of course, I also predicted that Russia will resolve the situation in Syria within foreseeable future, and it is happening. But the thing is that the Middle East still has a lot of strife and problems. But Russia has demonstrated and will continue demonstrating in the next couple of 3, 4, 5 years that only Russia can help bring all those warring forces together and make them sit down at the table and have a conversation. And more of these factions and countries that never talk to each other and that could kill each other on moment's notice, they will be coming to Russia to ask for help, for mediation. And this will be happening all over the Middle East. Sometimes the governments will just form a good relations with Russia and ask, say, for S-400s. These are advanced weapons systems, the anti-aircraft whatnot systems that Russia supplies to some of the countries as a big price. If you really have a good relations with Russia, if you really are, on the right side of history, let's just say, then you might be able to sign a contract for S-400s. Even Saudis are asking for it now. Okay, they want to pedal away from contracts with the U.S. and sign more contracts with Russia. So all this is will be happening in the next several years. More and more peace processes, and that's where Russian diplomacy and Russian military come into effect simultaneously. You know, there is a joke in Russia, a nice saying, I like it actually. Those who don't want to talk to Lavrov, Russian foreign minister and chief diplomat, will hear from Shoigu, and Shoigu is the Minister of Defense. So this saying has become popular ever since Russia went to Syria. So those who don't want to talk diplomatically and peacefully, then they will have to hear from whom? From Shoigu, who is the quintessential, archetype of this military/warrior defender, right? That's what's happening. And over there, they understand it very well. They understand force very well. They respect that. And they also super respect loyalty in the Middle East. In the Middle East, they actually severely lack that quality loyalty. And so anybody who displays it, they really are indebted to those people who stands by you. And they really respect providers of such. Well, that's basically what I see for the Middle East in the next several years. Of course, overall, it's very positive, although we will continue seeing, unfortunately, in the next, until at least 2024, that could last even longer. Sorry, but there will still be terrorist attacks that, again, is in line with my predictions in the Middle East and coming from the Middle East. ISIS and all this terrorist threat are not eliminated. They might push it out of Syria or primarily push it out of Syria, but it still exists elsewhere. But there is another amazing piece of potentially good news, and I will be following the developments. This is just the beginning of the process. But Russians are also pushing these countries to form a close alliance. Countries that never talked to each other before or were like literally at loggerheads. So Syria, Iraq, Turkey, and Iran might actually, that would include Russia and might actually include somebody else, such as Azerbaijan possibly, but maybe Afghanistan as well. These countries might form a major Middle Eastern alliance, sort of like a NATO of the Middle East, but it may go much further than that. It could be economic alliance where borders, in fact, are eliminated or borders become not true borders between countries. One of the reasons Russians are pushing these countries to go into close economic, social, and possibly military alliance is the Kurdish question. And that gets overlooked all the time, especially by the alternative media, maybe because people don't understand the nature of the Kurd problem in the Middle East. And the problem is such that there are 40 million Kurds officially living between four countries. Now, Kurds, they consider themselves one ethnicity, but they're divided between Iraq, Turkey, Syria, and one country, either Afghanistan or Iran. I'm not sure which. So Iran, okay. So they're divided up like this, but they want to have their own state. They're considered the largest single ethnicity on the planet without a state. They were promised that state by the British Empire. Attention, when British Empire was basically leaving the Middle East and carving it out. So they created Syria. Ottoman Empire was gone because Syria and parts of other countries were part of the Ottoman Empire in previous centuries. Ottoman Empire is gone. Turkey is formed. Syria is carved off and made its own state, which is absolutely legitimate because they have their own heritage, their own history, etc., etc. And so that's how Kurds were divided between four countries when Ottoman Empire fell apart and the British Empire was carving up the Middle East. So the Brits actually stiffed Kurds for their own autonomy, for their own state. And Kurds have been fighting to reunite and to have their own statehood ever since, and they still do. So Russians have pushed these countries to include, despite all the objections of every leader, Iran, Turkey, and Syria, they pushed them to include Kurds in the peace process and in the political process. So it's like a huge move to begin with. And also Russians are telling them, if you form an alliance, which is a close alliance with borders that are basically, if not open, but at least like relaxed borders, okay, like mild borders, then Kurds will feel a lot better about it, and they will not need to continue fighting for independence. They will feel more together because they will be in the same alliance, inside the same alliance. So that's another possibility that could happen in the next several years. Russians are working very hard on that, but we'll see what happens. If that happens, basically that stabilizes the Middle East tremendously, number one, increases the status of each country within that alliance tremendously. Literally, automatically, it boots out American bases from Iraq and Turkey automatically, because they will not, Iran will not tolerate that. Neither would Russia, neither would Syria, if they are within the same alliance. So they will be voted down immediately. So automatically, U.S. loses, NATO loses, and of course, U.S. has to leave Iraq automatically as well. Also, it diminishes the influence of Saudis in the Middle East and of Israel automatically, okay? Well, now, there is more about Israel, and I have to tell you, again, there are so many people who are anti-Israel and that continuously sending me some kind of emails insisting that I should talk more about Zionism and stuff. I do talk about it. Go to Earthshift Report 6 on ladaray.com. It's called, it talks about American Zionism and what is really behind the situation in Ukraine and attempts to turn it into the new Khazarian Khaganate. I talked at length about the whole history, how it was not how Zionism was born, that's common knowledge, but what in reality went behind the scenes, and Jews, etc., etc. I talk about it a lot, and I talk about it from the intelligent point of view, and from the point of view of somebody who comes from those parts and who knows stuff, okay, and who incidentally has been to Israel. Those people who send me these emails, why do I not talk more about Israel? And by that they mean, why do I not bash Israel more? Sure, go ahead and bash. I'm not defending Israel, okay? Israel has done plenty that and the Zionists have done plenty. It's your prerogative. But I'm telling you, I talk about it not only in a measured way, but also in an intelligent way and historically accurate way, not these fairy tales that you hear from somebody or sensationalist stuff, okay? None of that, okay? I talk about the true forbidden history. I talk about the truth as it is developing now. And I can tell you, as I was telling you before about Israel, what is happening is that Israel is also trying to sit on two chairs. And that's normal when some countries that are caught in between, we were close ally of the US for many years and of the UK. And now we see that something is shifting. Either US is abandoning us or US is overextended and they cannot handle it anymore. But we have to have contingencies. This is how they think. That's how Israelis think right now, and Saudis and even Qataris. Because they see that US swiftly losing the power, not just in the Middle East, but everywhere, in fact. And so these countries, they're trying to somehow create these contingencies that will allow them to stay afloat when the tide changes. That's what they're doing. And Israel, in fact, is trying to be on the good side of Russia, but they're trying to bribe simultaneously Ukraine, and they're trying to somehow stay on the good side of the US as well. But they're also trying to bribe basically Russia through certain things like intel that they share. So I heard this one thing. This is really funny. The former head of one of the intelligence services of Israel Israel. His name is Yakov Kedmi. He's a Russian Jew, one of those who was a dissident and immigrated from the Soviet Union to Israel. And Israel is everything for him. For him, that's his fatherland, motherland, his country. Russia is a foreign country to him. Okay, even though he was born in Moscow. And he speaks perfect Russian. He goes on Russian TV a lot. And he feels very pro-Russian right now, but it was not always the case. So he says, I will share very seriously, like secret cell with you. And all I'm going to say is that Israeli secret services and intelligence services have a very good relationship with Russia. That's what he said. That was the end of of that sharing. Of course, he is the ex-head of Nativ. Nativ is one of it's like a sister agency to Mossad, basically. Well, that's the story with Israel, for those who really want to know the truth, okay?
Hey, I got a question. Do you think it's possible that peace will break out and that area of the world will have really good economic growth? Because it seems to me that what holds them back is all their internal problems. You know, I mean, you can't really invest if you're afraid your investment will collapse. So.
Well, but see, that's the thing. Not every country is in this position, and different countries are making strides in let's just say, solidifying peace within their borders. And Egypt is one of them. I know you said there was a major terrorist act in Sinai. And again, I'm repeating, the reason there are terrorist acts is specifically in Sinai. Do you know what Sinai is for Egypt? Incidentally, that's a territory that belonged to Israel at some point, and they built some resorts there because it's a major sea resorts there. And so a lot of Russians used to go there. Fewer now. Some brave ones still go to those, but they attack because they want to scare off the tourists, and tourist revenue for Egypt means a ton, means everything, and Russian tourists for Egypt mean everything, right? So I'm just giving you this as an example. Another major tourist hub, and of course a very important place where a lot of cultures congregate, is Turkey. Okay, and again, they have a lot of terrorist attacks, whether they're false flags or not. Okay, and incidentally, Kurds are very much into that as well. In Turkey, they have their grievances. They have major grievances with Erdogan. And all this is happening while Erdogan is trying to somehow balance all this out. This is period 8. I talk about it in our Shift webinar 4, how period 8 works. This is period 8. It is notorious for terrorism, for the young man, which is like yang aggressive power, for military weapons, well, all the extremism, it's notorious for that. So we will continue seeing this. And the Middle East is very notorious for these kinds of like male chauvinism kind of inclinations, you know, where women mean very little or nothing even, religious fanaticism, or this Islamist terrorism that notorious for all this. So that's why period 8 for them, the concentration of these negatives of the period 8, which lasts until 2024, are located in the Middle East. So I expect this to continue. But as I said, when Russia engages, things start getting better. Much better. And it has been demonstrated time and again. It will continue being demonstrated. So what the Middle East, those smart leaders who actually understand and have the good of their countries as their primary goal and their primary interest, they will go to Russia. They will work with Russia. And they all still have major egos. It's very hard to get them together, to get them to work together. But this is how they would establish peace. Russia has to be present as the mediator, as the balance. If Russia is not present by themselves, they will not come to any agreements. That's where we're at. They know, nobody is actually mistaken about the true role of the US and EU and UK. We will separate that, because from the EU, because UK is sort of like trying to be on its own, right? And so they know exactly why the West comes to the Middle East, to destroy and to siphon out their wealth. They actually know to bring havoc, to bring wars, to separate them. They know this very well, but they're still not smart enough to understand they should stop fighting. Yes, go ahead.
As usual, I think you're an optimist. No, just kidding. It's a joke. The West.
I am an optimist. That's
the West
true.
has a proven track record there. Once or twice something happens, it's a coincidence. But you got a 100-year track record, I say. It's pretty clear what you are up
more
to.
than 100 years.
Yeah,
a lot more than 100.
More than 100 years. And even some of the things in the past I now have great doubts about, like the Napoleon's expedition to Egypt and all that. But let's see. Okay, what other things would you like to add for our listeners about this? I guess you can call it a new order, or the more manifestation of a shift. What else would you like to add about it?
Well, I think we actually did very well today, because we focused on one region only, and we pretty much concluded it. Again, very important, can't overemphasize this enough, that completely excluded from this entire major shift are the EU, UK, and US, completely, the entire West, in fact. But there was one interesting glitch in this, which I thought I'd mention in the end, and that's the Czech president. President of Czechia, you know that it used to be called Czechoslovakia. So now they're divided. These are two Western Slavic, let's just say, ethnicities. Because, as far as Slavs go, we have Southern Slavs, Western Slavs, and Eastern Slavs. And Eastern Slavs are Russians and their branches, Ukrainians and Belarusians, as Rusins. There is this sub-ethnicity called Rusins. Anyway, so Czechoslovaks divided up as a result of the division of the Soviet Union. They actually broke up their country as well. Now they're kind of making strides to come back together, but there are still a lot of confrontation or disagreements between the two, sort of. So two separate countries. So a Czech president flew to Sochi, and he is considered the most pro-Russian, or the only pro-Russian, if you will, leader in the EU and generally in the West. Okay, so he always goes to Russia, to all kinds of congresses or summits, even in Asia. When Russians go to, say, to China, there was recently a summit in China, he also showed up there. So he tries to keep that bridge, even if everybody else is not doing a very good job in the EU or in the West in general. He's trying to keep that bridge open, that dialogue open. So he went to Sochi and met with Putin and participated in that. He insisted on being included. And of course, he was the only representative from the EU or proverbial Western general over there. And Putin actually has a good relations with him, and he likes him. There's a good personal rapport there. So he does include him in these happenings. And the first saying during the joint presser that the Czech president uttered was that Russia won in Syria. He makes this statement. And then Putin modestly, oh, well, we haven't finished fighting yet, but yeah, we made some good strides. It sounded like that. So that's very telling who was in Sochi as this unofficial representative of the EU. Let's just say, okay? Then after that, Slovakian, head of Slovakian state, which you remember used to be Czechoslovakia, now it's a separate small country. Slovakian president flies to Russia to meet with Putin, where he's head of the parliament of Slovakia, I misspoke, head of the speaker of the parliament, and he flew to Moscow to give a speech to the Russian Duma, which is the Russian parliament, of course. He made a speech there, and he was actually calling on the EU during that speech in the Duma. He was calling on the EU to abolish all the sanctions and to get closer to Russia, for which he got a lot of flack when he came back home, because all the press and a lot of politicians in Slovakia are completely under the US and, like, say, Germany's and Brussels' thumb, and they are completely neoliberal globalist faction there. But there are some very high-level politicians that are trying to get through to others or speak directly to Russians or speak directly to their people, such as the president of Czechia or the speaker of the Slovakian parliament. And this guy, the speaker of the Slovakian parliament, he said he will not apologize for what he said, that he lauded Russia on their strides, and that Russia actually doesn't need the EU as much as EU needs Russia. He said he is not going to apologize for anything like that or calling for better relations with Russia, that this is actually the future. This is where everything should be going. This is where Europeans should be heading, and that Slovakia will be increasing. He also announced that its trade with Russia dramatically. And that apparently was agreed upon, this particular statement, that the trade relations with Russia and between Russia and Slovakia will be on the increase, because a lot of countries suffered in the EU specifically from sanctions with Russia. So Slovakia has to restore trade, and they want to grow it much further. What I want to point out here is that I wrote recently this mega article about the secret order to exterminate Slavs. I know it sounds very harsh, but that's the actual honest truth. Anybody who ever looked into this subject will know that this is the truth. And I'll give you just one fact. After World War II, and that's after huge devastation that Slavic people suffered specifically, and especially Russians, during World War II, the percentage of the Slavic population in the world was 7%. Right now, it's under 3.5%. Okay? Well, that's also because, of course, major birth explosion in Africa, Asia, and the Middle East ever since. But they always had big families, so that's actually not an excuse. But there are a lot more things that go on. Those who are interested in this article, go on Futurist Trendcast and find it there. So the fact, and I say in that article, incidentally, just to give you another clue, is that those who allow themselves to be pitted against other Slavs, or those who allow themselves to fight within their own countries, up of Yugoslavia, and went down between Serbs and Croats and Bosnians, who, yes, have different religions, but they in fact are the same people. They're so close. They're all Southern Slavs who at one point or another assumed different religions because it was more profitable for them, you know. But same thing with Ukraine. This terrible war that is happening in Ukraine, Slavs fighting Slavs, the same people, in fact. Same with Czechia and Slovakia. That was a peaceful divorce, but they did divorce. And they were seared. Both Czechia and Slovakia have been seared all this time, ever since they broke away, not only to stay away from Russia, but also to become Russia's target and Russia's enemy. And they refused to. That's actually along with Hungary, these are exceptions in Eastern Europe. When Americans came to them and promised them lavish bonuses and a lot of trade contracts and whatnot for allowing to locate American AMDs in Czechia, Slovakia, as well as Hungary, those countries refused. Poland agreed immediately. And Romania agreed immediately, and they were actually begging Americans to do so. But Czechoslovakia and Hungary actually refused to be seduced by that. Well, that's actually major important thing to understand. So there is a rift in this iron curtain that is being reinforced all the time between Russia and EU. These countries right in the middle, in the center of Europe, they're not allowing themselves to get too far too far removed from Russia. They actually want to kind of come back and do more and somehow serve as a bridge. And so both Slovakia and Czechia, their leaderships, they are very cautiously, but they are announcing time and again that they are ready to serve as a bridge between Russia and the EU. Very important to understand. So my article about the extermination of Slavs, the more all the Slavic countries understand that they're under a total attack, and why they are under attack is because, first of all, to damage Russia as much as possible. The fewer Slavs in the world, the fewer people such as Serbs, for example, who are major fans and major allies even in spirit of Russia, even if they don't have any agreements at any specific moment. So you damage the Slavic, let's just call it the code, that historic affinity, that genetic, that genome, that historic memory, that ancestral code that is embedded in them. You damage that, you rewrite that. And what happens as a result? As a result, it happens that Russia, the great balancer, is weakened. So there's definitely attack. And it's very good that there are countries like Czechia and Slovakia are smart enough to at least not to succumb to the worst version of it. So that's actually a positive news on which I wanted to end this, because it's all related.
Well, I'm sure that our listeners can find more on your website. Okay, well, thanks for coming, Lada. I think we can see the new order forming in the Middle East, and it's a better one. So I think we should all be happy about that. And then I guess the earth shift in progress, right? So, well, let's call it a wrap.
Yes.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.